Hello, my name is Gerry Stokka. I'm the Extension Veterinarian here at NDSU and also the Livestock Stewardship Specialist. Been asked to talk a little bit about vaccines, vaccinology, immunology, and maybe a little bit more specifically about route of administration. In other words, intranasal versus SubQ and IM vaccines. I want to start here because this brings a little reality to our discussion. This is an email that was sent to me a number of years ago from one of my colleagues in Georgia that was involved with a bull test station. He was a veterinarian. So I want to go through this with you, and then we'll revisit this scenario as we come to the end of this talk. So now, again, I'll just reiterate: a Georgia bull test station where bulls are sent to a common facility, and then they're grown and measured average daily gain of feed efficiency. So as per a vaccination protocol sent to the bull test years ago by someone at the vet school in Athens, Georgia, where the vet school is, incoming bulls must be vaccinated 2 to 3 weeks prior to arrival with an IBR, PI3, BRSV, BVD type 1 and 2. It doesn't say whether that's killed or modified live, but those are viral vaccines in that particular vaccine. Also included was Mannheimia hemolytica, Pasteurella multocida, Haemophilus somnus, which are bacterial respiratory pathogens, and then a Clostridial 7-way. At processing, boosters are given using whatever vaccines either Zoetis or Boehringer Ingelheim have chosen to donate. And then he ends with this, with a little sarcasm. I don't know what's given. I'm not invited on that day. The second part of this email was this, just to provide a little history and context to this discussion. Typically, processing is around July 5, and the bulls are sold around December 7. Within 7 to 10 days after arrival, there are numerous cases of respiratory disease, which are treated, may be retreated, and the process really runs to late November, which is a long time. And his question was if the protocol pre-arrival and at processing was an intranasal vaccine, abbreviation being IN, like TSV2, which is a very common intranasal vaccine that has IBR and PI3 in it, and an intramuscular or subcutaneous administered Mannheimia along with Pasteurella vaccine plus the Clostridial, but leaving out the Haemophilus would there be less BRD? I would appreciate your advice, call or email for more information. Thanks. So we'll come back to that and we'll try and address that question and see if we can arrive at an answer. This slide is just to remind all of us that there are stressors in the lives of animals for which there are no vaccines. Now, a moderate amount of stress, cattle can handle pretty well. Human beings can too. In fact, I would argue we function better with just a little bit of stress in our lives. But when the stress becomes too much, when it accumulates over time, or when it becomes chronic, that can result in an animal being somewhat immunosuppressed. And maybe that accumulated stress comes from difficult calving, or it comes from severe weather stress, or it comes from feeding stress, or it comes from a BVD PI animal that's infected in its entire life and looks like this and shedding virus to everybody in the pen? Or does it come from commingling, in other words, putting a bunch of calves together that aren't used to one another? All of this together, if you took it together with what I would call accumulation stress or piling on stress, and some of this leads to chronic stress, like being constantly exposed to BVD PI animals. So what it does, it pushes those cattle into a different risk category, and they're not able to handle some of the pathogens that they may face later on. I'm just going to use one example of virus. We're not going to talk about BRSV or BVD, or I'm just going to focus on IBR, and primarily it's because of the vaccines that we have today, especially the intranasal ones that contain IBR and PI3. Now there's some on the market that contain IBR and PI3 and BRSV, namely Inforce 3 and I think it's called Nasalgen 3 as well. So just a little background information on IBR. If I expose an animal to IBR, the time period from exposure to when that animal starting to show signs that it's sick is going to be 3 to 5 days. Pretty short incubation period for a virus. Human coronavirus is maybe 4 to 5 days, maybe just a couple days longer. But IBR is pretty short, 3 to 5 days. During that time, or subsequent to that infection, after that incubation period, now I'm going to get some fever starting. That animal will act like it's sick, it's got a fever, maybe a little bit depressed because of that fever, and then I'm going to have virus show up in the blood, and that's what that viremia term implies, is that after a certain period of time, that virus has exploded and replicated many times. I've got virus in the different organs, in the lungs, in the liver, in different places, and I've also got it in the blood. It's circulating in the bloodstream. That's what viremia stands for. If I start off with a seronegative animal, which simply means it's an animal that hasn't been vaccinated or exposed, that animal is going to shed virus to its pen mates for probably at least 11 days after infection, and maybe even a little bit longer. This next slide gives us a little bit of an indication of what that looks like on a kind of schematic here. So I've got two images in this single slide. On the top image here, I've got the same. I've got the x-axis is the same. I got 5 days, 10 days after infection, 15 and 20. This vertical axis, this y-axis here, just simply means I've exposed that animal, or I've even vaccinated that animal. We'll use the term expose that animal. And it takes a little while for that animal to mount a fever because it's got virus in its system. The system is telling him he's got to fight this virus, so the animal responds by building a fever. So like 4 or 5 days, I got a fever. It might drop down a little bit, but then it may come back again as well. Almost a biphasic response in terms of fever. This purple line here indicates that this animal, once it starts developing a fever and that infection has kind of gained a foothold, now it's going to start shedding virus to its pen mates. This is why we wear masks, I guess, with coronavirus, is that we're trying to cut down on virus shedding. We're not stopping it. Don't ever get the idea we're stopping virus shedding. You're still shedding virus. We're just trying to lessen the load of virus, if you will, by wearing a mask. Well, we don't put masks on calves. That doesn't work very well. Instead, what we try and do is vaccinate them so that they don't go through this same situation when they're actually exposed to the real virus. The bottom image here on this same slide shows the immune response. I got two different antibodies that are produced. I got IgM, which is a great big antibody, and then I've got IgG, which is the one that we usually measure in the bloodstream. If I take a bloodstream, I take the red blood cells off, and what's left is what we call serum. If I measure the serum, I can determine how much antibody is in that serum following an IBR infection, or following coronavirus infection, or following BVD. That's a very simple test to determine whether an animal either has responded to a vaccine or has actually developed antibodies as a result of being exposed. For example, in human coronavirus. This other line here that's designated by these green and blue, dark blue boxes has an acronym associated with it called CMI, cell-mediated immunity. I need both of these lines to occur. I need antibody response and I need a cell-mediated response in order to control a viral infection. I'll make one comment about interferon. Interferon, as you can see, is produced very rapidly. The advantage an intranasal vaccine may have is that interferon is going to be turned on quicker than if I give it IM or SubQ. Remember that interferon is not specific. It doesn't specifically know what an IVR virus is, but it allows those cells that are being infected to inhibit the virus from entering into that cell. So interferon is a very important non-specific response, and interferon may turn on just a little bit quicker with an intranasal vaccine over SubQ or IM administered vaccines. Again, another schematic, but I just want to point out how this immune system works. I'm going to use these kind of light green colored stars to indicate this is vaccine. This gold AP designates a cell in the bodies or in the immune system of animals. We have them too. That takes vaccine and presents it to the immune system. So what happens here is that this immune system cell, we call the dendritic cell or antigen processing cell, takes that virus, or at least pieces of it, and tells the immune system what it needs to do. And then this T helper cell finally makes that determination, presents it to a T helper cell. The T helper cell says, we need some antibody. We need some antibody production. so that it can bind some of that circulating virus. But we also, in the case of virus infections, need these killer T cells that go around in the body and find virus infected cells and eliminate them. And then finally, in both sides of this immune response, we need these. We need memory cells for the cell mediated, and we need memory B cells so that when an exposure occurs the next time following vaccination, or I give a booster dose, I've got a population of memory cells that are ready and available to respond even in a much quicker fashion. A reminder to all of us that when we give a first dose of a vaccine, the immune system doesn't have a whole lot of cells to respond to it the first time. So my response is going to be somewhat diminished. I'm going to get some antibody response, but if I follow that up with a second dose of that vaccine, and typically our labels say 21 to 28 days later, I'm going to get a beautiful booster response, or what we call an anamnestic response, especially as it relates to these antibody response. If we could have a good test to measure cell-mediated response, it'd be the same thing. We get a nice, beautiful booster response. Now, the timing of the first and second dose is not always precise. We've done some research that indicated we could have as much as 150 days from first dose to second. At least we measured that as regards BRSV and as regarded Mannheimia hemolytica. Not all vaccines will respond in the same way, but this gives us a little bit of better idea that it doesn't have to be just 21 to 28 days. It actually can be longer than that. This is just an idea that not all cattle will respond the same. If I have an overall population that, let's just say that this is the average of the response, pretty good response. I'm going to have some animals that respond very poorly, a group down here, and I'm going to have some animals that respond really well. Maybe the take-home message from this is that when I give that second dose, perhaps I can tighten up this window. Maybe it's more like this. Maybe I've got more that are in this area where they've got more of them have an adequate immune response such that they can protect that animal. Just a picture of a feedlot just reminds us that cattle that are somewhat in close contact with another need to have a fairly decent immune response to be able to protect them when they're in this kind of environment. Talk briefly about vaccines and how we use them and how they should be used. I use 3 questions. I ask myself 3 questions. If I'm going to use a vaccine, is there a reasonable risk that my cattle are going to be exposed? As it relates to IBR, is there a reasonable risk that my calves might be exposed once they go to the back runner or the feed yard? Yes, there's a reasonable risk that they might be exposed. So I'm going to use that vaccine. The second question is, do vaccines actually work? Do I have confidence that modified live IBR vaccines actually do what they're supposed to do? Yes, I do. There is a fair amount of scientific research that demonstrates the efficacy of IBR vaccines. Do all vaccines have that much data behind them, that much science behind them? They don't. And so I need to answer these 2 questions. Is it necessary? Because there's a risk. Do the vaccines work? And finally, are they safe to use? The only comment I'd make down here, sometimes when you vaccinate animals, these animals can develop a little bit of, we call it sweats. They don't always. I'm not always sure why it occurs, but they might set them back just a little bit. We did some research with clostridial vaccines, for example, showing a feed intake drop following vaccinations. It's the same in human beings. Sometimes the vaccine makes us feel just a little bit sick, but it's also telling us that the immune system is probably working pretty hard. Just a couple of applied sides here. I'm gonna deal with 3 different scenarios. High-risk animals in the northern plains, which in my mind means they're auction market derived, they're commingled, we don't have any vaccination history. What am I going to do with those calves? And before I go through these, I'll just tell you, make sure you visit with your veterinarians about what you're going to do with these different risk categories. But I'm going to make sure I provide tender loving care, and that doesn't matter what kind of cattle you've got, but especially for these high-risk animals, tender loving care. Limit the number of head per pen. By that I mean when I get over 100 head in a pen, it's not as easy for me to manage and watch animals the way I'd like to. I want to feed a palatable ration. I want to have bedding. I want to have space. I want to have good water. and I'm not going to give a whole lot of vaccines to them. Maybe I'll give a modified live 5-way virus vaccine, and that's fine. If I'm going to use an intranasal, I'm not going to use both of them at the same time. I'm only going to use an intranasal. Now, there are no 5-way intranasal vaccines, so I'm going to have to use a BVD vaccine separately, of course. But don't use them together. And if I'm using intranasal on high-risk animals, make sure you change that nasal cannula on every animal. I don't want to contaminate the animals that follow another with something that animal may have been carrying. And finally, I'm probably going to use a dewormer on these animals. Could be either injectable or drench. Then I need to make a decision with my veterinarian whether I use prophylactic antibiotics on these calves. For moderate risk calves, and by that I mean Northern Plains calves, we mean 45 days, that have a vaccination, their bunk broke, they've already been commingled on the ranch of origin, I'm going to keep it simple. Maybe all I do is give a modified live 5-way virus with Mannheimia hemolytica. On the other hand, if they've been handled properly, I may decide not to give them anything in regards to vaccines. I may go ahead and implant them depending on what program I'm involved with. For low-risk calves, what I call mostly yearlings off grass, have a vaccination history, they've already been commingled. Again, it's the same for me. I may not give any vaccines at all. If I do give one, I might give a modified live 5-way virus vaccine with Mannheimia hemolytica. I'll decide whether to implant or not. If they fit the program, probably going to deworm those yearlings coming off grass. Let's come back to this scenario that we talked about at the beginning, the Georgia Bull Test Station report. Those animals had to be vaccinated 2 to 3 weeks prior to arrival with preferably a modified live. It doesn't actually say that, but a 5-way viral vaccine, Mannheimia, Pasteurella, Haemophilus, Clostridial 7-way, and then they give boosters at processing and whatever they get donated. And then I'll repeat this scenario that typically the processing is around July 15th. The bulls are sold around December 7th. They got numerous cases of respiratory disease, and he wanted to know if the protocol has changed pre-arrival and at processing. If an intranasal vaccine like TSV2 or Enforce or Nasalgen would be better along with an intramuscular and SubQ vaccine, plus the Clostridial emitting the Haemophilus with less BRD. Let me just answer this one very quickly. The answer is no. This is not a vaccine issue. In almost all cases, this is not a vaccine issue. Does it mean the vaccines are no good? No, it doesn't. It means that unless you address the commingling issue here, there is no vaccine for commingling. Unless you address the commingling issue, it doesn't matter what vaccines you use or don't use, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. I am somewhat of a fan of intranasal vaccines. However, I like to use them in calves as the first dose for the IBR and BRSV. Beyond that, I really don't use them. I go ahead and use the SubQ IM vaccines, 5-way viral vaccines, and I try and limit some of these vaccines that I'm going to be given. If I was dealing with highly commingled cattle, I probably wouldn't use 7-ways. I probably wouldn't use some of these other vaccines either. It just depends on what some of the specifications and protocols are on some of these programs like this one for entrance into that program. Covered a lot of ground. I want to make sure that you understand that vaccinations are not a silver bullet. They address a very precise issue. I consider them to be health insurance, and yet at the same time I'm going to use some, but I want them to be necessary to use. I want them to work, have evidence they work, and I want them to be safe to use. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll have questions later on.